I'm working on a book about strange encounters across the forests of the Pacific Northwest. Nothing serious or academic, just collecting stories from different towns and isolated communities that claim to have witnessed something unusual. I'd already visited a dozen places before reaching Red Pine. Small forest towns, remote settlements, places where people swore they'd experienced something in the woods. Most of those stories felt thin, like local legends that had been embellished over time, told and retold until nobody could remember what had actually happened versus what had been added later. The coffee at Maggie's counter was the best I'd had in 3 weeks on the road, and that's saying something when you've been living out of motels and gas stations from the California border all the way up through Oregon. It was thick and dark, and tasted like someone actually cared about it, which felt strange after so many cups of brown water served by people who looked through you like you were already gone. I'd been driving since 5 in the morning. Red Pine was my 7th stop on a research trip that had started to feel less like journalism and more like penance, the kind of work you do when you've run out of better ideas. My editor back in Portland had given me the assignment with the particular smile people use when they're handing you something they don't want themselves. Guardian of the Forest stories, he'd said. Local legends. Soft feature. Fill 3,000 words and we'll run it in the Sunday magazine between a recipe column and an advertisement for hiking boots. I'd said yes because I needed the money and because I'd said no to too many things lately. Red Pine sits in the Cascade foothills about 60 miles east of Eugene, tucked into a valley where 2 creeks meet, and the Douglas fir trees grow so tall and close together that even at noon in summer, the town gets only a few hours of direct sunlight. Population, around 2,000. 1 main street. A hardware store, a post office, a general store with a hand-painted sign that looked 30 years old, a small library, and Maggie's Diner, which wasn't actually called Maggie's, but which I came to think of that way because she was always there, and the place seemed to run on her energy alone. I arrived on a Thursday afternoon in early November. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy and low, the kind of sky that feels like a ceiling pressing down. The trees on either side of the road going into town were enormous, their trunks disappearing upward into fog. Everything smelled like wet bark, and something deeper underneath, something older. Earth that had been accumulating centuries of fallen needles and rotting wood and animal passage. The smell of a place that has been doing its business without any human involvement for a very long time. The diner had 4 tables, a counter with 6 stools, and a chalkboard menu above the coffee machine. There was a woman behind the counter who I guessed was in her late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair pulled back, and the kind of still, watchful face that takes a while to read. She poured my coffee without asking if I wanted it, which I appreciated. A television mounted in the corner had the local news on, with the sound turned down. 2 older men at a table near the window were eating soup and talking in low voices without looking up when I came in. I ate eggs and toast and wrote some notes in my notebook and tried not to feel like I was wasting my time. 7 stops, and the best story I had was about a family in Northern California who claimed a large animal had chased a mountain lion away from their campsite. Possibly a bear. More likely a bear. Not exactly the material that keeps a career alive. I asked the woman behind the counter, whose name turned out to be Maggie, whether she'd heard any stories about unusual animal encounters in the forest. I said it casually, the way you learn to ask early in a reporting trip, keeping it vague so the person can take it wherever they want. She looked at me for a moment, not unfriendly, but measuring something. "What kind of stories are you looking for?" she said. It wasn't quite a question. I told her about the book, research trip, guardian legends, protective creatures, that kind of thing. I kept my voice neutral and professional, the voice I used when I didn't want to sound like I was either a believer or a skeptic, just a person collecting information. She refilled my coffee without answering right away. One of the old men at the window table said something to the other that I couldn't hear, and they both looked at me for a moment, and then looked back at their soup. "Talk to Thomas," Maggie said finally. "He's at the library most mornings. Tell him I sent you." That was all she said. She moved to the other end of the counter and began wiping it down with a cloth, even though it was already clean. I thanked her and went back to my eggs. The television showed footage of a wildfire somewhere in southern Oregon, the kind of footage that looked the same every year now. The two men at the window finished their soup and left, and the bell above the door chimed when it closed behind them. The diner was quiet after that. Outside, the fog was thickening, moving between the trees at the edge of town in slow, deliberate waves. I watched it for a moment, without really thinking about anything. Then I noticed the window. There was a handprint on the glass, just to the right of the doorframe, low enough that I'd walked right past it. It was partially obscured by condensation, but the shape was unmistakable. A handprint. 5 fingers, a broad palm, a thumb that angled outward. Normal in every way except for its size. The span of it, from the base of the palm to the tip of the middle finger, was easily twice the length of my own hand. I sat looking at it for a long moment. Then I looked at Maggie. She was watching me from the end of the counter, with the cloth still in her hand, her expression unchanged, and she did not look at the window. Thomas was 81 years old and had been living in Red Pine for all of it. He had a white beard, hands that shook slightly when they were still, but steadied themselves when he was making a point, and the unhurried manner of someone who has decided that rushing through a sentence has never once improved it. He met me at the library the next morning, in a reading room in the back, where 2 upholstered chairs faced each other across a small table. Someone had set a thermos of coffee there before I arrived. I didn't ask who. He didn't ask about my credentials, or my book, or who I worked for. He just looked at me for a moment, the way Maggie had, measuring whatever it was these people measured. And then he said, "You want to understand what red pine is. You have to understand what the forest is first." I told him I was listening. "The forest isn't a place," he said. "People from outside always think it's a place, like a park, like something with edges. This forest doesn't have edges that matter. It goes back 100 miles in every direction, and most of it has never had a name. Most of it has never had a human footprint. It has its own logic, its own patterns. It takes a long time to understand those patterns, and most people never get far enough in to even start." He told me the first story while I was still settling my notebook on my me. A boy named Caleb Durst, 12 years old, had gone missing in the forest in the summer of 2009. He'd wandered off a campsite trail while his family was setting up tents, the way kids do when the forest looks interesting and the distance looks manageable, and neither of those impressions is accurate. The search began within an hour and continued through the night. By the second morning, there were 40 people combing the ridges north of town, including sheriff's deputies, Forest Service rangers, and volunteers from 3 neighboring counties. They found him on the morning of the 3rd day. He was sitting on a rock at the edge of a clearing about 4 miles from the campsite, wrapped in a layer of large fern fronds that had been arranged around his shoulders and lap with a care that made the first responders stop when they saw it. He was cold and hungry and exhausted, but he had no hypothermia, no significant injuries, Nothing that should have been survivable in 40-degree nighttime temperatures without shelter. He told the paramedics that something had kept him warm. He said it in the calm, factual way children sometimes describe things that would terrify an adult, as if fear hadn't been part of the experience at all. Something big had sat near him in the dark, not touching him, just close. And in the morning it had moved away, and he had walked in the direction it pointed him. He said the thing had pointed with its arm. He demonstrated for the paramedics, extending his own small arm with the index finger out, a gesture of ordinary direction. Then he asked if he could have something to eat. I wrote this down and asked Thomas what the search team found when they backtracked from where Caleb had been sitting. Thomas drank his coffee. Footprints, he said, leading from the campsite area all the way to the clearing. Not one set, several sets, moving in different directions, converging on where the boy was. Whatever found him had been searching, same as the rescue teams. I asked how large the prints were. He looked at his own hand, spread flat on the table between us. "Put your hand down," he said. I put my hand flat on the table next to his. His was larger than mine, thick-fingered, mapped with the lines of 8 decades of outdoor labor. "Now imagine something where my hand looks like yours," he said.
He watched me write that down. "Second story," he said, and set his cup down, and the library was quiet enough that I could hear the rain starting outside, tapping against the high windows in a slow, irregular rhythm that didn't sound like weather. It sounded like something keeping time. He told me about Elena Marsh, a woman in her 60s who had been driving home alone on Route 42 in the winter of 2014 when her car went off the road on a curve the locals called the Devil's Elbow, a stretch where the road angles across a hillside with a 40-foot drop on the downslope side. The guardrail was old and had been bent by previous impacts and did not hold. The car went through it and rolled twice before stopping against the base of a large fir tree. The road crew that found her the next morning estimated she had been in the car for 6 or 7 hours. She was alive, which the paramedics described as unlikely given the severity of the impact and the overnight temperatures. She had been moved to the back seat, which was the only part of the vehicle with structural integrity remaining. She had been wrapped in pine boughs. Her seatbelt, which had been jammed by the impact, and which the rescue crew had to cut to remove her, had been loosened around her torso and retightened in a way that reduced the pressure on her broken ribs. The paramedic who told me this part later, a man named Garrett, who I tracked down through the county records, said he'd spent 16 years in emergency medicine and had never seen anything like it. He said whoever had treated her in the field had understood injury mechanics, not first aid, actual trauma care. The positioning, the rib protection, the way her airway had been kept clear. He said it was the kind of intervention that kept someone alive through a winter night who otherwise wouldn't have made it to morning. I asked him what he thought had done it. He was quiet for a long time. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "I don't think about it less as time goes on." Thomas told me 4 more stories that morning. A hiker found unconscious near a ridge with a broken leg, who was discovered 2 miles from where he'd fallen, dragged to a spot directly beside the main trail. A child who fell into the creek in 2017, pulled out before her family could reach her, sat on the bank with water still running off her hair, breathing. An elderly man who had a cardiac event while cutting wood alone behind his house, found by his wife 40 minutes later, lying in the front yard in the recovery position, a position he could not have moved himself into, and which the emergency responders confirmed was the correct response to his specific type of cardiac event. In each story,
the pattern was the same. Someone vulnerable, someone genuinely in danger. An intervention that required both enormous physical capability and precise, intelligent understanding of human biology. And then, nothing. No witnesses, no explanation. Only evidence left behind for those willing to read it. I walked back to the motel in the rain. I was turning the stories over, looking for the seams where memory and embellishment joined together, the way I always did. The habit of 14 years of fact-checking and source verification. I was good at finding those seams. It was the thing I was most proud of professionally, and lately, the thing that felt most hollow. The motel was a single-story building set back from the road with a small parking lot and a vending machine that hummed outside the ice room. I was the only guest. The owner, a man in his 50s named Dale, who wore the same green jacket every time I saw him, had given me the room at the far end with the best view of the tree line. I was at my desk writing up notes from Thomas when I heard it. A sound from outside my window. Not loud. A slow, deliberate sound, like something pressing against the building's exterior wall. I waited. It happened again. A pressure and a release, the wall flexing very slightly under weight. I went to the window and looked out. The parking lot was empty. The rain had stopped. The trees at the edge of the lot stood black and close in the darkness, and the fog was low and thick between them. On the wall directly outside my window, at a height of about 8 feet, there were 2 parallel marks in the weathered siding. Long, downward scrapes in the paint, spaced 14 inches apart. Something had been standing outside my window with its hands on the wall. I spent the next day being efficient and rational about it. I photographed the marks. I measured them. I walked the perimeter of the motel looking for footprints in the soft ground along the foundation and found none, because the gravel path that ran around the building didn't hold impressions. I considered the explanations. A branch, an animal, kids, something falling from the roof. None of them fit the geometry. None of them accounted for 2 parallel marks at 8 feet, with the spacing of a handspan too wide to be human. By afternoon, I was at the library again, not to see Thomas, but to look at the newspaper archives. 14 years of the Red Pine Courier, bound and shelved by decade. I spent 3 hours with them. The pattern in the newspaper records was not what I expected. I had expected to find the stories Thomas told me, or versions of them, written up as local curiosities, strange reports, the occasional breathless front page about a Bigfoot sighting. That was the template I knew from other towns. What I found instead was an absence. The Courier covered everything: school board meetings, road improvements, business openings and closings, the weather, high school sports, obituaries. It was thorough in the way small-town papers are thorough, which is to say, exhaustively thorough, because in a town of 2,000 people, a change in the hours of the post office is news. But the rescues Thomas had described, the interventions, the impossibly surviving accident victims, they appeared in the record only as brief items. A sentence or two. Person found alive. Hiker recovered. Family escapes house fire. The details that made those stories what they actually were, those details were not in print. I asked Dale at the motel about it that evening. He handed me a spare key card without looking up and said, "People here don't like too much attention." I pushed. I told him I'd read the newspaper archives and found the gaps. I told him about the marks on my wall. I kept my voice level, professional, the way you do when you're trying to get information from someone who doesn't want to give it. He looked at me for the first time since I'd walked into the office. His expression wasn't hostile. It was patient, the way you are patient with someone who is close to understanding something, but hasn't arrived yet. "The forest knows you're here," he said. "It's been knowing since you got to town. That's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's just a thing. What happens next depends on you, not on it." He went back to the paperwork on his desk. I stood there for another moment. Then I walked back to my room. I sat on the bed in the dark without turning the lamp on. Outside, the wind had come up and was moving through the firs, a sound like breath, low and continuous. I opened my notebook to a clean page and wrote one line in the dark, by feel, not looking at the paper. "The gaps in the record are the story." Then I put the notebook down and made a decision that I knew, even as I was making it, was not entirely rational, which was perhaps the point. I had been rational for 3 weeks on this trip and had nothing. In the morning, I would go into the forest. I started on the Ridgeline Trail at 7 in the morning, while the fog was still solid between the trees, reducing visibility to about 30 feet in every direction. I had a full charge on my phone, a compass, 2 liters of water, and enough layers that the 45-degree air wasn't going to be a problem. I told Maggie at the diner where I was going, which, in retrospect, was the closest thing I did that morning to a responsible decision. The Ridgeline Trail runs north from the edge of town for about 6 miles before intersecting with the Cascade Divide route. I wasn't going 6 miles. I was going as far as it took to understand whether the forest was simply a forest or whether it was something else, which is the kind of objective that has no natural stopping point, and which I recognized even at the time as evidence that I was not thinking as clearly as I believed myself to be. For the first mile, the trail was easy and well marked. Wooden posts every quarter mile with orange blazes. The trees opened enough in places to see the ridge above and orient myself. I passed a creek crossing on a log bridge and a campsite ring with a rusted fire grate. The ordinary infrastructure of a maintained trail in a national forest. Reassuring in its ordinariness. Around mile 2, the trail became less defined. The blazes were farther apart and harder to see in the fog. The trees were larger here, older, the kind of trees that predate any trail system, that were standing when there was no red pine, no county, no Oregon as anyone understood it. Their root systems buckled the trail surface into irregular steps and humps, and the canopy above was dense enough that the forest floor was nearly dry even after days of rain, the moisture absorbed before it could reach the ground. The sound changed at mile 2 also. The ambient noise of the lower trail, birdsong, the distant creek, the muffled traffic from the highway far below, fell away. The forest at this elevation was nearly silent. My own footsteps sounded disproportionately loud, and I found myself stepping more carefully than the terrain required, minimizing the noise I made without consciously deciding to do so. At mile 3, I stepped off the trail. I don't have a good explanation for why. There was a gap in the trees to my left that looked like a path, the kind of opening that suggests passage without actually being a path, and something about the angle of the fog through it made it look like it led somewhere with more light. I marked my position on my phone's GPS and went through the gap. The ground was softer on this side, the needle cover deeper, and my footsteps made no sound at all. I walked for about 10 minutes into the trees, and the fog closed behind me, and the gap where I'd entered was no longer visible. I stopped and turned around slowly, and all directions looked the same. Douglas fir, 60 feet tall, straight and dark, the fog hanging between them at about knee height. My compass said north. North meant nothing here, because I'd been walking at an angle and hadn't tracked how many degrees of drift I'd accumulated. I stood still and listened. The silence was not empty. That was the thing I noticed first. It was a dense, inhabited silence.
the silence of a space that is being used for purposes other than sound. The forest was doing things all around me that I couldn't detect because I didn't have the equipment to detect them. Movement in the soil, growth in the wood, the slow mechanical work of organisms. And something else, an attention. The distinct physical sensation, which I know sounds like the description of a feeling rather than a fact, of being in the focal point of something's awareness. My skin registered it before my conscious mind did. A slight increase in the fine hair on my forearms, a tightening across my shoulders. The same response your body gives you in a dark parking lot when something feels wrong before you've identified what.
I took out my water bottle and drank some, and tried to be calm and analytic. Then I heard the footstep. One footstep. Behind me and to my left. A sound like a large, flat weight pressing into the needle carpet. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Not trying to be silent. Not trying to announce itself either. Simply present. I did not turn around immediately. I stood with my water bottle in my hand and breathed carefully through my nose, the way I had read you were supposed to breathe when you needed your hands to stay still. After 5 seconds, I turned. Nothing visible. The fog, the trees, the knee-high mist. But the smell hit me in the same moment I turned, and I have spent months since trying to find an accurate description of it, and failing. Organic, yes. Animal, yes. But deeper than animal, older than animal. The smell of something that lives at such remove from human spaces that its biology has become entirely its own. Earth and resin, and something underneath that I had no reference point for. Something my hindbrain recognized, and my cortex could not name. I stood very still, and the smell intensified, which meant whatever it was closer. And then a sound came from my right, closer than the first footstep, and I turned toward it. A branch landed across the path I'd been facing. It was a thick branch, 3 inches in diameter, freshly broken. It had not fallen. The break was clean, the kind of break that requires a deliberate bending force, not a drop. It had been placed. I looked in the direction the branch pointed away from. Another branch came down from my left, quieter, landing at an angle that formed a V with the first. The 2 branches pointed in the same direction. I went that direction. For 20 minutes I walked, and the branches came. Not constantly. At intervals, when I drifted, when I moved toward a gap that looked promising, but led nowhere. Each time I was going wrong, a sound would come from the trees, not a branch sound, a different sound, lower, a resonance more than a noise, something felt in the sternum more than heard with the ears. And then a branch would come down to correct my course. I never saw the source. I looked. I looked systematically, scanning the spaces between trees at different heights, watching for movement in the fog. Whatever was doing this was managing its visibility, which implied an understanding of fog and distance and sight lines that was not accidental. The fog thinned, and the ground sloped down, and the orange blazes of the main trail appeared through the trees 20 feet ahead. I stepped back onto the gravel surface of the ridgeline trail and stopped. Behind me, in the forest I'd just come out of, there was one long moment of complete silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the trees, at a distance I couldn't accurately estimate, a sound. A single, deep exhalation. Not threatening. Almost the opposite of threatening. More like the sound a person makes when they've completed something they were concentrating on. I stood on the trail, and my hands were shaking, and my notebook was in my jacket pocket, and I did not take it out. There are things you try to write down immediately, and there are things you know the writing will ruin. I stood there until my hands stopped shaking. It took longer than I expected. I walked back to town. The fog lifted entirely by the time I reached the trailhead, and the afternoon sun came through the firs and put long gold bars of light across the path. And the forest looked exactly like a forest, quiet and indifferent. And I understood that both of these things were true at the same time. My bootlaces were re-tied when I got back to the motel. I was certain I had not tied them on the trail. I had noticed them loose before I went into the gap in the trees and decided it didn't matter. Both laces, doubled knotted, tight enough that it took me a minute to get them undone in my room. That night, I drove to the diner and found Maggie at the counter at 8 o'clock, with the place otherwise empty. I sat down, and she poured the coffee without asking, and I told her everything. The branches, the smell, the sound, the bootlaces. I told it all flatly, in sequence, without editorializing, the way I had been trained to tell things. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What do you want me to tell you?" she said. I said I didn't know. I said I'd been doing this work for 14 years, and I had built a functional professional life on the premise that the world was explicable, that given sufficient patience and investigation, a source for every claim could be identified and evaluated. I said I no longer knew what to do with something that fit none of that structure. She refilled my cup, even though it was still mostly full. "It's not one thing," she said. "That's what everyone gets wrong who comes here and looks for one thing. There's no creature in the woods with an address you can find. There's something much harder to explain than that." She told me about her grandmother, who had kept a garden on the edge of the forest for 50 years, who talked to the trees the way some people talk to houseplants, who left offerings at the tree line on the solstices, not from superstition, but from a sense of relational obligation. Her grandmother had said the forest was a system, not a metaphor for a system, an actual system with inputs and outputs, and a kind of distributed intelligence, the same way a mycelial network is intelligent, processing, signaling, responding. The rescues, the interventions, the impossible survivals, those were the system maintaining itself, keeping the humans who belonged to the valley in the valley. "Why those humans?" I said. "Why not everyone?" "Because not everyone takes care of it," she said. "It doesn't help people who are here to take. It helps people who are part of the place. And sometimes people who are going to become part of the place." She looked at me steadily. "Like you, redirecting yourself on a trail you got lost on." I sat with that. The coffee was hot, and the diner was warm, and outside the fog was back, pressing against the glass. And the handprint was still there on the window near the door, and now I understood that it had been there for a long time, and that nobody had cleaned it off because nobody here wanted it gone. I asked Maggie if she had ever seen it. She said yes, once, at the tree line behind her house, when she was 9 years old. She described it the way you describe something that marked the permanent before and after line of your understanding. Not frightening, not supernatural, more like finally seeing the shape of something that had always been there. I drove back to the motel slowly. I pulled into the lot and sat in the car for a while with the engine off. The trees at the edge of the lot were dark and still. The fog moved through them in slow pulses, in and out, like breathing. I had my notebook open on the passenger seat. I had been writing and crossing out and writing again for the last 3 weeks, trying to find the right frame for the stories I was collecting, the right analytical distance. I looked at all of it, and I turned to a clean page. "The truth about red pine," I wrote, "is not in the evidence. It is in the system. It is in the relationship between a place and the people who have decided, consciously or not, to belong to it. The forest does not protect people because people deserve protection. It protects people because they are part of its structure, and a system maintains its components. I closed the notebook. In the trees at the edge of the parking lot, something moved. Not dramatically. A shift in the darkness, a displacement of fog, the suggestion of a shape too wide and too tall to be anything I had a name for. It stood there for perhaps 3 seconds. I could not see eyes or features or anything definable, only size and stillness and, at the edge of perception, that smell. Then it was not there. I sat in the car for another minute, breathing. Then I went inside and slept, without dreaming for the first time in months. I packed up on a Saturday morning, settled with Dale, drank one last cup of Maggie's coffee at the counter. She gave me a paper bag with a sandwich for the drive, the way you do for someone you expect to see again. I thanked Thomas at the library. He shook my hand and held it for a moment, and looked at me without saying anything, which felt like more than most things people say. I drove out on Route 42, the same road where Elena Marsh had gone through the guardrail 8 years earlier. The morning was clear and cold. The sky above the ridge was a pale winter blue, the first clear sky I'd seen since arriving. The trees on both sides of the road were enormous and close and utterly still, and the mountains above them were white with early snow. I had what I'd come for. Enough for 3,000 words, enough for 10,000 if I let it run. But I drove for 40 miles before I started to understand what I was actually going to do with it. The stories of Red Pine were not stories about a creature. They were stories about a covenant, a long, quiet, mutual agreement between a community and the living system it inhabited. The forest gave protection. The town gave privacy. Neither side advertised the arrangement. It persisted because both sides understood that exposure would end it. That the moment Red Pine became a destination for people looking for proof, the thing being proven would cease to exist in any useful sense. You cannot study a relationship that requires privacy without destroying it. I thought about what Maggie had said. The forest helps people who are going to become part of the place. I thought about the bootlaces. I thought about the branches on the ground, pointing me home. I thought about the shape in the parking lot that had stood and watched and then withdrawn. I thought about the handprint on the diner window that nobody wiped away. I merged onto the interstate, and the trees thinned, and the world opened up into the flat, gray ordinariness of the valley floor, and I drove south toward Portland and thought about what I was going to write and what I was going to keep. The feature ran 4 weeks later, 3,000 words, small town, local legend, guardian stories. I kept the names different and the specific details soft, and I did not mention the Ridgeline Trail or the bootlaces or what I smelled in the fog or what stood at the edge of the parking lot and watched me from the dark. My editor liked it, said it had a different quality than my recent work. More present, he said, like you were actually there. I finished the longer account, this account, in my apartment in Portland over the following 2 months. I went back to Red Pine twice to verify details and to see Maggie and Thomas and to walk the main trail on clear mornings when the fog was low and the light came through the trees in the way it does in that valley, which is unlike any other light I've encountered in 14 years of traveling to places people consider ordinary. On my second return visit, I stayed for a week. On the 4th night I was there, something knocked on the door of my motel room at 2 in the morning. 3 slow, heavy knocks. The door flexed inward with each one, the frame straining, the sound of something with far more weight behind it than a human fist. I lay still in the dark and did not answer. The knocking did not repeat. I got up after a minute and looked through the peephole, and there was nothing in the lit corridor outside. In the morning, I looked at the door. The wood on the outside surface had 4 shallow, parallel marks in it, beginning at shoulder height and running downward. the marks of something dragging fingers slowly down the door as it turned to leave. They were 18 inches from the top of the mark to the bottom. I measured them twice. I am telling you this so you understand that what I brought back from Red Pine was not only a story. I am writing this in Portland, in my apartment, 3 floors up in a building in the middle of the city. 3 nights ago, I heard something on the roof directly above my bedroom. A slow, deliberate sound. The creak of weight settling onto the flat membrane, moving in a pattern above me. Back and forth, then still. Back and forth, then still. I did not go up to look. The next morning, my neighbor in the apartment below mine knocked on my door and asked if I'd had guests the night before, because something had been on the roof, and she could hear it through her ceiling, and it had kept her awake. I told her it was probably just the building settling. She looked at me for a moment. "It wasn't the building," she said, and went back inside. Last night, at 11:40, I got up to get water from the kitchen and passed the window that faces the alley. The alley has a light on the far wall that throws enough illumination to see the ground and the opposite building's face. There were footprints in the snow that had fallen that afternoon. Deep, evenly spaced, in a line that came from the direction of the street, passed directly beneath my window, and ended at the wall of my building. They did not continue. They simply stopped. As if whatever made them had gone up the wall. I stood at the window for a long time. The alley was empty. The snow was still. The footprints were real, and I was awake, and there was no interpretation of them that I found comforting. The forest is 300 miles away. Whatever lives in it apparently is not. If you've read this far, you already know this isn't the kind of story that ends cleanly. I didn't find a creature. I didn't get a photograph. I came back with something harder to hold and harder to put down. A change in how I understand the line between what watches and what is watched. If that unsettles you the way it unsettles me, subscribe. There are other towns. There are other agreements between people and places that most people never hear about, because the people involved understand exactly why silence is part of the deal. I'm going to keep going until I understand what I'm looking at, or until I accept that understanding was never the point. And one more thing, because I need to ask it somewhere, and this is the only place I have. The footprints in the alley stopped at my wall. I told you that. What I did not tell you is that when I went down to the alley the next morning to photograph them, I found something else. At the base of the wall, directly beneath my window, there was a small pile of pine needles. Fresh ones, still green, the kind that fall from a living branch and not from a dead one. Douglas fir. The same species that lines the Ridgeline Trail outside Red Pine. I live in Portland. The nearest Douglas fir to my building is 4 blocks away in a city park. Someone brought those needles to my window. Something carried them 300 miles and left them there deliberately, the same way the fern fronds were arranged around Caleb Durst in the clearing, the same way Elena Marsh's seatbelt was retightened around her broken ribs. With intention, with care, with a precision that does not belong to anything acting randomly. I don't know what that means. I've been sitting with it for 2 weeks and I still don't know what it means. But I think it means I'm not done with Red Pine. Or, Red Pine is not done with me. Tell me in the comments if you've ever felt watched by something that didn't feel hostile. Because I think more people have had that experience than are willing to say so out loud. And I think the reason they don't say it is the same reason the people of Red Pine don't put it in the newspaper. Some things stay true only as long as you don't try to prove them.